In this episode, we're going to begin reading from my book, Some Gave It All. I had the opportunity of writing this book with American hero Danny Lane. Danny Lane is a Marine from the Vietnam era. He has 2 Purple Hearts that he earned in that war to keep you and me free. It's endorsed by Chuck Norris as well as many other people such as Lee Cockrell from Disney fame and directors Arch Camacho and Corey Edwards, as well as other people. So I'm just going to read sections of this book. This will be part 1 of that, just to give you a little taste of the book, and then we'll go on through the story as we go. So it'll be real informal. Welcome to my office, by the way. And it'll be very informal, and if I make a mess up as I read, we're just going to continue on just as if we're reading a story together in a classroom setting. All right, this is from the prologue. Broken arrow, bellowed a soldier into his field radio. Command, we are being overrun. The soldier put away the radio and began firing his machine gun. Explosions dimly lit the night sky, like fireworks on the 4th of July. At a nearby foxhole, a young Marine saw the shadowy, ghost-like silhouettes of the suicidal enemy sappers as they charged through the American defenses. The North Vietnamese army used these demolition commandos expertly to breach the American defenses. Terror filled the bones of the young Marine. A kamikaze sapper charged his position, wired with explosives, leaving him little to ponder his feelings. The sapper jumped into the foxhole, landing on top of the young Marine. The 2 men struggled hand to hand in a fierce battle to the death. The young Marine knew he had only seconds before the sapper would activate his explosives, killing both men. With a swift, desperate motion, the young Marine swept his bayonet from its sheath and drove it into the waiting chest of the enemy. Silence enveloped the young Marine's soul. At that moment, it was as if all life had stopped. The young Marine looked into the dying eyes of the enemy, then watched as his chest heaved with its final breath. But it was those piercing eyes that haunted the young Marine at that moment, and for every moment to come. Late September in West Virginia was normally cold and crisp. This year, 2006, was no different. As the hazy fog began to roll in over the hills, the frail man in his mid-50s staggered to his feet. He was wearing only a pair of black shorts that hung on his emaciated frame. Hard gravel crunched under his feet, then a wooden beam. Then more gravel, then another beam. He walked on the tracks as the whistle grew closer. The Amtrak train had arrived right on schedule. He collapsed on the gravel beside the railroad tracks. Startled by the blaring siren of the fast approaching Amtrak train, he labored to open his eyes and was blinded by the oncoming light of the locomotive. He lifted his head in the approaching light, and water dripped off his head and hair. A drop landed in his right eye, and the man slowly wiped it away. He then closed his eyes as if to entrust his fate to the oncoming train. At that moment, a nearby drunkard staggered forward and shoved the man hard off the railroad tracks, narrowly saving his life. As the train passed, the man struggled back to his feet. The drunkard angrily slurred, "Man, what the is wrong with you? You trying to kill yourself?" Little note here to my listeners is when there's a cuss word in the text, I am not going to say that word. I'm just going to kind of go through it, kind of bleep through that, if you will, or kind of the grunting sound I made at that point. But you'll get the point. And if you're following along in the text in your copy of Some Gave It All, you'll know exactly what was said at those times. And by the way, if you are following along, we are on page 14 in the prologue section. Continuing on with the story. The man's eyes wandered and tried to focus on the blurred image of the Kroger supermarket in the near distance. Struggling towards the parking lot, he stumbled through the automatic door and into the brightly lit grocery store. The man needed help, and he wanted help. But no words came from his mouth. Finally, he was overcome with weakness and fell, his head hitting hard on the concrete floor. The Kroger cashier looked over the counter and shook her head in disgust. Just another drunk, she thought to herself. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? This is Brenda over at the Kroger store on 1st Street. We have another drunk passed out on the floor. No shoes, no shirt. He's unconscious. The man struggled to form the words he needed, but was only able to quietly whisper, "Daniel Edward Lane, United United States Marine Corps, number 2461294. No one heard. The police and EMS arrived together just a few minutes after the 911 call. They did a quick examination and quickly lifted the man on a gurney and into the ambulance. He appeared intoxicated, but there was something about him, something different. As the ambulance sped to the hospital, EMS called into dispatch. Unit 410 running code to St. Mary's. White male, mid-50s, unconscious, no ID, possible concussion. Vitals are not good. Call ahead to have the trauma unit on standby. 10-4, 410, I will notify them, came the immediate response from dispatch. The driver stomped hard on the gas pedal. He had the feeling that time was a commodity they were running short of if this guy was going to survive. On arrival at the hospital, EMS hurriedly pushed the gurney through the large glass sliding doors and into the ER. Dr. Shane Bowen moved hastily to the door as soon as he heard the ambulance pull up. Who do we have here? Don't know, Doc. No ID. He just walked into the Kroger and collapsed. Possible concussion. He has a knot on the back of his head. His vitals aren't good. Okay, let's get him into the room stat. Get that IV hooked up, and let's run his vitals again, said Dr. Bowen. After a few minutes, the man was hooked up to an EKG machine with an IV running from his arm to a bag of clear liquid on a pole next to the bed. Dr. Bowen scratched his head. Who was this mystery man? And what was going on in his body? Dr. Bowen looked towards the police officer standing nearby and asked, Do you have any information on this guy yet? No, not really, said the officer. He was seen on the railroad tracks acting like he didn't care if he lived or died. He was pushed out of the way of the Amtrak just before it hit him. There are no missing persons reported matching his description. So far, no one has called in with any additional information. Wow. That drunkard must have been his guardian angel, said Dr. Bowen. He then turned to his medical assistants who were waiting near the bed. Let's get him into x-ray to get his head looked at, and then let's get him upstairs. The door buzzed and someone hurriedly entered the room. Dr. Bowen instinctively turned to see who had entered. To his surprise, it wasn't a nurse. A young man in his mid-20s entered the room with a look of despair. The strong, fit young man located his father and ran to his side. May I help you? Asked Dr. Bowen. That's my dad. I've been looking for him all night. He disappeared and I couldn't find him. I finally called the police department and they told me that an unconscious man had been picked up at the Kroger and brought here. I'm Chris Lane. Yes, he came in that way and is still in serious condition. What is his name? Danny Lane, said Chris. Danny Lane, the police officer and karate guy? Asked a shocked Dr. Bowen. The one who knows Chuck Norris and brought him to town? Yeah, that's him, said Chris. I thought he looked familiar. I remember seeing him on the news, but he's lost a lot of weight. This is Danny Lane? Yeah, that's him. Is he going to be all right? He's been really sick for the past 5 months. He's been having flashbacks from the war and talking out of his head, said Chris. What war was he in? Dr. Bowen asked. Vietnam. He was a Marine and saw a lot of combat. Wow, he must have gone through... That had to be about 40 years ago. What years was he in Vietnam? Asked Dr. Bowen. 1968 and 1969. Well, that's the beginning of our story of Some Gave It All. Stay tuned for our next episode and we'll continue Danny's story and find out what happens to him. This is Mark Bowser. Thanks for listening.